Okay, welcome to Levels Baptist Church Sunday night Bible study. We have been working our way through Esther, and we've completed the first 6 chapters, so tonight we'll be starting in chapter number 7. One of the interesting themes that's come up time and time again throughout the book of Esther is this idea that the name of God is not actually mentioned. And of course, we've talked about how God sneaks his name in there, and you have to dig a little bit to find these neat little places that God does that, and we'll touch on one of those today. But there's this human weakness that we all have. When something is not kind of right in our face, something's not right here in the wide open, something that we can see very easily, something we can interact with, something that we've learned about, that we're knowledgeable about. Many oftentimes we almost just assume, well, maybe it's not even real, maybe it doesn't even exist. And the truth of the matter is, things exist all the time, all over the planet. Especially when you consider this past Wednesday night, we talked about some really fantastic things in regards to the wonderful ability of God to create some really fantastic things. And the fact that you don't know that those things are true or that they exist doesn't mean they don't exist. They do exist even when you're not aware of them. And so I think Esther kind of helps us learn that there are things that are in existence, things that are real, such as God. Even throughout all of the book of Esther, throughout all of the things that they've dealt with, God was alive and well. He was real the whole entire time, regardless of the fact that the name of God doesn't come up in the book of Esther. And so, again, there's been these hidden patterns, these parallel verses and different things that only God could have worked out. We've found those. We've talked about it. They were there all along, regardless of whether you just learned about it like I did this year in this study, or even if you already knew about it. It is a little frustrating when you learn things like this, because you just wonder, well, why didn't I know about this sooner, and how many other things like this exist in all of the rest of the Bible. But nonetheless, whether or not you and I know that it's there doesn't change the fact that it's there. If it is there because God put it there, then it is there whether we know about it or not. So, yes, maybe God is what we would normally, we kind of have this saying, out of sight, out of mind. And when you're reading and studying Esther, it's easy to fall into that and say, oh, out of sight, out of mind. God's not mentioned specifically. Maybe he's not there. Maybe he doesn't have anything to do with it. Nothing could be further from the truth. And sadly, just living our daily lives, we fall into the trap of, as long as things are going well, God's out of sight, out of mind. Things are going well. We don't, quote unquote, need God. And we sort of tend to drift away maybe to some degree. Something happens, tragedy strikes. All of a sudden we remember very quickly that God is real. God is the great I am. Well, again, he was the great I am the whole time. Whether you are acknowledging him or not, whether you are praying or not, whether you're taking your cares and concerns to him or not. So here we are learning that God, this great I am, he is. There is no place out of his reach. There is no place that he does not exist. There is nothing that he doesn't know. And there is also nothing that can prevent his will. In the book of Daniel this morning, we were talking about this angel that had been slowed down for 21 days, but nonetheless, the Lord's will was carried out. Nothing can stop God's will. So God is there whether we recognize him or not. God is there through all of these happenings in the book of Esther, whether he's mentioned in the book of Esther by name or not. He may be unacknowledged, maybe even unseen, but nonetheless, God was still there the entire time. And so this is a good lesson for all of us to learn over and above the rest of all the other lessons that are good for us to learn. We should keep in mind each and every day that the great I Am does exist. He's alive and well. Even whether it's good times or bad, the great I Am is. Okay, so let's get into Esther chapter 7, verse number 1. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. I want to say a few words about the idea of translation. How different people treat it differently and how different translations will give you a different verse. Maybe similar, but sometimes they'll leave a word or two out, or they might even add a word or two that is not even supposed to be there. And I wanted to use this very simple verse to do that because it is a very simple verse. You wouldn't think there would be a whole lot of variation with such a simple verse. But nonetheless, I've got a few different translations that I want to read. Now, I just read King James. NIV says, so the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. Sounds pretty simple and straightforward, right? Pretty easy. ESV, so the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. Where did the word feast come from? In the New King James Version, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. Where did dine come from? So the king and Haman came to dine with the Queen Esther. That's the NET. The NASB, now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. On and on. I've got a couple others here, but I'll skip those because the point is some of these translations leave words out. Some of them add words in. Some of them interpret words. They give us a word that has the same meaning rather than the actual word that they should have given us. This very simple verse can be translated in multiple ways, but if you don't get it right, you're getting it wrong. You're losing something. You're not getting the point of what the verse is trying to say. So again, with such a simple verse, there is a ton of variance in the translations depending upon what translation you're reading. And I'm not picking on any one of them. I'm not saying which one is right or wrong. Read this one, don't read this one. That's not the point. The point is, if there's a little bit of variation in this very easy, straightforward verse, imagine how much variation there is when you get into more complex verses. It may seem unimportant to point this out to you, but again, this is very important. The way the verse is translated from the original language, from Hebrew in this case, to English, it is important. What you find, sometimes translators are not necessarily scholars. They just simply translate. If they follow some very scholarly people very closely, then they may get a very well-grounded understanding of the context, but nonetheless, they're still likely to make errors in their translations. So it is very important when you get a translation that it is line by line, word for word, and not something done casually or halfway. Again, if they can make a mistake on a simple, easy verse such as this, where you're just trying to convey the message that 3 people met to drink, to have a banquet, if you can mess that up, again, think how bad it can get in other long, more complicated verses. Let me give you an example. In the original Hebrew, there is a word that typically translates to drink. So that's there. They met to drink. Well, why did some of the translators add the word wine? It wasn't necessarily a huge mistake because that's understood. They did meet to drink wine in that day, in that time, and then it's even mentioned in verse 2. So it wasn't necessarily that big of a deal to add the word wine. But is it right to add any word if it's not there in the original text? Well, it's not necessarily wrong as long as you make it known. So notice in your Bible from time to time there's words that are italicized or underlined or put in brackets or parentheses. Whatever the case, the translators are wanting to make sure that you understand, in this case, maybe the word wine, we're signifying, we're letting you know somehow that that is not there in the original transcript. Again, I read the King James. That's what I use. I study with that. I do read other translations, but I typically use King James most of the time. Well, it makes a little bit of an error here. It uses the word banquet in place of the Hebrew word that should be translated to drink. They're using that word banquet as a verb. Well, it's not that far from the truth. It's really not something that's misleading or misguiding. It's not changing the end of the story. So you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, when you get confused by that is when they use the same word banquet in another verse in a different context. So then you start seeing, okay, wait a minute. Does banquet mean banquet all the time? Or does banquet mean to drink sometimes? And how do I know the difference? Well, that's why I study not just in one translation in King James and not just in English, but I'll use the internet to pull up the original language. Moving on. You must have consistency. Very important. The verse says to drink. That has to be, the equivalent translation has to say to drink. If they add a little bit of something to it, it may not be the end of the world. But again, you need to have the same thing, consistency going forward in every case. In verse 2, just the very first part of that says, and the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine. See, there's where it says wine. Nonetheless, here it's almost as if they're being overly wordy. Why is this in here? And the king said again unto Esther on the second day. Why is all of that included? Why do we need that all over again? Because that's already understood. We know what's going on. We know it's a second day. We know it's a second banquet. Or do we? That is the point, to nail that down, to make sure that we know that this is the second day and this is the second banquet. For whatever reason, the queen withheld her request at the first banquet and has asked for the king and Haman to attend a second banquet. And again, it says the banquet of wine. So what was the banquet for? What were they to do? Well, it wasn't just to sit around and look at each other. They were to drink. And again, in verse 2, it introduces wine. So that's why maybe it wasn't that big of a deal to use the word wine in the first verse, other than the fact now you're repeating it. You didn't need it in the first verse. Anyway, they are having a banquet for a particular reason. It is to drink, but then obviously it is to socialize, to converse. In the original language, by the way, the word translated banquet is a Hebrew word that specifically tells you that wine would be involved, and specifically fermented wine. So was there food or not? There could have been, but that wasn't the point necessarily. And we'll talk about that. Why? Well, the queen, she knows the king. She knows what his tastes are, his preferences, but she's also seen his history as to how it is he reacts or acts when it comes to drinking wine. Well, we all know how he acts also, because we learned way back in Esther chapter 1, right? She's counting on a little bit different king to be here in this moment. If he comes and drinks some wine, she's counting on there being an extra level of passion, possibly. She's counting on the influence of the wine, making him the king, the person that she needs him to be in this moment. Again, we saw it back in chapter 1 with Vashti. We also mentioned back then in the study of chapter 1 that the word and the idea of drinking and the idea of wine and what it would do to a person mentally and how it would change them, this was a symbolizing of something. This was the merging together of expressions into a result. The thing that ought to happen can happen, and that's symbolized by wine. So again, Esther probably learned that. Now, was she there? No, not necessarily. She didn't see this with her own eyes, but I'm quite sure she studied and learned. It was probably known among the people who knew the king, especially among those who were considered wives. So, there was one banquet on one day, followed up by a second banquet on the next day. This is very important that we understand this. So it's not just the Bible being overly wordy. Everything happened on the first day, and then something in the middle, and then the banquet on the next day. And it's been a lot. It's been a couple of Sunday nights worth of study, right? Well, what we know, what's turned out to be true, is all of this has become something that weighs heavily upon the minds of both the king and Haman, and they're the two that are there in attendance, that are taking part in this banquet. So let's read all of verse 2. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Now this is very close to chapter 5, verse 6. So let's just read that. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Well, the only big difference between these two verses is the king adds in the words when he says Esther in chapter 5, period. Now he says Esther the queen. So this is a bond. Esther the queen. It shows something very important. Now remember, this second banquet comes after him having a night of no sleep. Why was he going without sleep? Most likely because his queen, Esther, had come before him. Now remember, she risked her life to come before him. So this is a really big deal. So he cannot fathom what could possibly be so important that she's willing to risk her life to come before me, invite me to a banquet. We go to the banquet, and it's so important she can't even bring it up the first time. She's delays, puts it off, and asks for a second banquet. He can't sleep. And of course, again, we talked about it. This was the providential. This is God's hand at work, because that night of no sleeping is when he reads about Mordecai saving his life. Look at chapter 5, verse 3. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to half of the kingdom. He calls her Queen Esther, obviously indicating that she was accepted. So this has to do with the fact that he's not going to have her killed. You're the queen. You're okay. You're going to live through this. Her request seemed almost trivial considering what's at stake here. Really? That's all you're here for? You just simply are inviting me to go to a banquet, me and Haman, my bud? At that feast, he asked her again, but he didn't call her Queen Esther in front of Haman. That's interesting. The first time, the first day, the first feast, he just calls her Esther. Then she delays and asks for a second banquet. It was a request which would cause him the night of having no sleep. And he would just be thinking about it all night long. She hasn't asked me yet for whatever it is that she is wanting. And it's got to be a really big deal because she put her life on the line. Well, he couldn't sleep. He gets up. He has the records read back to him, the Chronicles. And that's the whole deal with Mordecai. He realizes he has a debt that must be repaid. So this request has got to be really important for all of this to be building up to where it's gotten to now, where we're at this point. She is obviously special. She's important. She's a queen. But I think she's more than just simply a beautiful woman. I think we're seeing perseverance and patience. Now he's acknowledging her differently. She was just Esther in front of Haman the day before. Now at this second event, second banquet, second day, she is Queen Esther. And maybe the way he's feeling about her is a little bit differently. He's learned something in the last 24 hours, almost like she's earned the title Queen in these last 24 hours. Look now at Esther 7 verse 3. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. Esther is most definitely either extremely intelligent and very skillful in her speaking, or maybe this is just simply the Holy Spirit working through her here. Her words are abrupt. She is showing deep emotion. She is also asking, she's responding twice because the king asked twice. He asked two different questions. What is your petition? What is your request? So she accepts it as if he's asking two different questions. And when she answers, she gives two different answers. First, her petition is for herself individually. She says, my life. Then when she answers the second time, it is for my people. So is that what's happening here? It matches. It makes sense. Some would look at this and say, the king was just kind of being overly wordy. He really wasn't asking two questions. He was only asking one, almost like when you and I are having a conversation and I'm concerned about you. I know that some things are going on in your life, and I give you a call or I text you. I say, what do you need? How can I help? Well, technically that's two questions, but really today in 2020, I really only meant one of those questions, even though I gave two. It's uniting both thoughts into one gracious offering. Any normal answer would be one answer, even though I asked two questions. I need to borrow some money, whatever you might ask as a response. You wouldn't say, I need to borrow some money and I want you to help me wash my car. That's just not the way we speak. You wouldn't give two answers. You would understand, you would know that the two questions really meant one. Well, in her case, give her credit, I think she's kind of taking advantage of the way things are being worded here. He asked two questions. I'm going to take full advantage. I'm going to give two answers. Maybe that's what's happening. I'm not sure, but it feels like it. It looks like it. Well, it's also another point here, the way, again, very skillful, very intelligent, the way she's talking with the king here. She says, if I have found favor in your sight. Up until this point, when speaking to him, and this is in reference back to chapter 5, she spoke to him in the third person. She says, if I found favor in the sight of the king, if it pleases the king. Now in chapter 7, this is second person. Instead of saying the king, she says, your sight. So she has moved herself a little bit closer to him from third person to second person. These first words to him may have even surprised him a little bit. I mean, was it as big a surprise as your wife saying, hey, I want you to buy me a Rolls Royce? I don't know, but I think there was some level of surprise here. What she has spoken is probably so far from what he had been imagining. Remember, this has been on his mind for 24 hours. And so for just a split second, is he wondering, is this a joke? Is this finally it, what she's really asking for? Remember, this was high stakes. When she first came into his presence, her life was at risk. She had one request, and she asked for a banquet. Then she delays. Then she asks for another banquet. Well, let's read verse 7 again there. 7, just the first part of it. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. So, Esther, I'm sorry, I read the wrong verse. Let's read Esther chapter 7, verse 4, just the first part. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Stop there for now. Esther is specifically using the words here that were written in the royal edict, the words of Haman himself. And the letters were sent by couriers unto all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. She has identified her people and their plight. They're united. She has admitted that she cannot be exempted from what will come upon them. From this, she then follows up, not with words which she would do, but what she would have done. So going on in Esther 7, now the next part of verse 4. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue. Stop there. These people, her people and herself, they've been sold to destruction. Any person, whether you're a criminal or even a foreigner for that matter, typically most of the time you would be allowed to petition for your life. This is her exercising that right. Why? Because her life has been tied to this edict against all the Jews. By default, that includes her. She's a Jew. They had not been given this chance to petition for their lives. This is her chance. She's doing it here now for herself and for all of her people. But she goes on. She takes it a step further. And this is really emphasizing the fact that it's life or death. Literally life or death. Now, it would be okay if you wanted to make us slaves. We would still be alive. I wouldn't even bring that up. I wouldn't even talk about it. We would just fall in line and we would be okay with that. But this is too great of a thing for me to remain silent. The fact that it is actually life or death. The last of chapter 7, verse 4. Although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. This is some very obscure language. This is very difficult to translate, and there is a lot of different translations that disagree as to what this means and what it says. Scholars, this is one of those things that's so difficult. Scholars say that even ancient translators don't even help in giving what this is saying and what this means. What makes it so difficult, what makes it so hard to translate this, is she's using two extremely rare words. One of them is translated and though or although. It's found here and in Ecclesiastes chapter 6 in verses 5 and 6. The second is a word that is only used one time in all of the Bible, and it's here, and it's typically translated injury or damage. So next to that, there's another word. It's translated the enemy. And this whole thing is extremely difficult to figure out what these three things are, what they mean, and how they fit together in with the context. It almost says, even though the enemy is not equal to the king's hurt. Well, when you try to figure it out, what is the context? What is she trying to say? What do you paraphrase it? How do we get this into understandable words that we can figure out what she's saying, what this means? Robert Young takes the word enemy, and he, instead of translating it enemy, he translates it adversity. And it is used in a similar manner in other places. So it's as if the verse says, even though the adversity is not equal to the loss of the king. In other words, if the Jews were simply sold into slavery, she would have kept quiet. Even though they would have to endure this terrible position of being slaves, that wouldn't be equal to what the king or the entire realm would suffer and loss. She's saying that as a people, they were more valuable as free citizens, more valuable to the king, more valuable to the empire than if they had been made slaves. But nonetheless, that monetary value, that offset, that would not have been enough for her to take this time and this risk to bring this to the king's attention. She would have let it go. She just would have just fallen into slavery and left it alone. But how much of a loss would it be to the empire for the Jews to be destroyed, entirely annihilated? This is extremely different. Their value diminished a little bit is one thing, but to be totally destroyed and the empire loses their value completely and entirely, that's something that gets the king's attention. So again, the words here in the original Hebrew are very obscure. This is very hard to translate and to understand her point of what she's saying, but she gets the king's attention. His anger boils over. Now look at Esther 7. We'll just read verse 5, just the first part of 5 here. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he? These words here, this is very easy to translate. Very easy for us to understand. Just simply take them as they are intended. It sounds wordy. It's as if there's too many words here. The word said is there. It feels like it was added to stress something, and you would want to drop it. And the king said in a stunned manner to the queen would feel better in English. But he is the king, she is the queen, his queen. The unity of the bond is being highlighted here. The words are a foretaste of his allegiance to her throughout this ordeal. I said that once to you towards the beginning of the study, that this wording by him calling her Esther Queen was something that showed a uniting. It also, I feel sure, is him as a person who has been drinking wine. Maybe that bond is not there if he hasn't had a couple of glasses of wine. But anyway, and I'm just saying that because that's what the Bible gives us, and I don't think it gives us too many words just to be wordy. If the Bible mentions something, I think it does so for a reason, and there's meaning in those words. The rest of Esther 7 verse 5 goes on to say, who is he, where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? This is a little bit funny here when you study this in the original Hebrew language, because the words are short, they're abrupt, it's almost double talk. It's as if he's stuttering and stammering. He's so mad, he's angry, it's like he can't even get out a complete full sentence. He's just like he's stuttering, stammering over his words. These are very short words. And this is a perfect example of a person who has kind of been blindsided. Again, we don't know what he was thinking she might ask, but it wasn't this, right? He's taken off, he's caught completely off guard, and he's upset, he's instantly angered, he can't get out a complete sentence. It's funny, the contrast, because she has been speaking so skillfully. Her words have been so meaningful and so direct, and her speech has just been A-plus level speech. And now here his response is C-. I mean, this is barely passing here. Completely, totally insufficient to convey the thoughts that were most likely going through his mind. Of course, we don't record those kind of words, right? We don't want to hear them or read them. So his words here in the original translation, if you did it word for word, says this: who, he, this, and where this he. You feel how bumbled that is? He can't make a complete, coherent sentence that makes sense. Who, he, this, where this he, that filled his heart to accomplish thus. That's the direct translation from Hebrew to English. Now, again, he's stuttering, he's stammering, he's angry. The words, it's almost as if every one or two words comes with a sentence, a period after it, like he just can't complete a thought and put it into words. Nonetheless, God takes full advantage of recording these words just exactly the way that they were spoken for divine purposes. And here's the reason why. And again, this reflects back on 2 or 3 other times we've done this. I told you about these hidden acrostics where God's name is not given straightforward, one letter at a time. But when you take either the first letter of 3 or 4 words in a row or the last letter of 3 or 4 words in a row, you have these acrostics that you find here. Here's another one. Perfect timing for it to show up in this verse in the book of Esther. Now, in those words, I am comes both ways, forwards and backwards. So when you look for it, you can't miss it. Now, obviously, many people haven't looked for it, and it's been missed by many for years and years, but nonetheless, it's so obvious when you find it. Again, it's there forwards and backwards. It's from the Hebrew words that are translated, he this and where this. So again, whether you spell it forwards or backwards, you take the final letter of each of those Hebrew words. Again, this and where this he. Again, forwards or backwards. Both acrostics. Let's see. Well, and another interesting thing too is the 5 words are palindromic. So it's the same sentence, whether you start at the beginning and read from left to right or at the end and read from right to left. It says the same thing in the original Hebrew language. He this and where this he. Extremely remarkable. Again, you really have to dig to find things like this. So, when you read it forward, the acrostic, it signifies that the Lord, I am, had determined the end which will occur, and he is bringing it about now. But when you go backwards, it signifies that the end is approaching for the matter, but that I am is overruling what had previously been determined. Both of these things are happening at the same time. It's kind of a stake in the ground to say that from this moment on, things are going to change, are going to be different in redemptive history. Those strange words, this king that's stuttering, he's stammering, he can't put together a coherent sentence, and he says, he this and where this he. This strange sentence that in English is barely understandable, and you can just feel the heat, the anger, the tongue twistedness of this verse. The king is asked the question, and the answer is hidden in the question. Just the scene, the heat, the anger, the short words, the stuttering, the stammering. There is a human agency which has determined evil for the people of God. Someone that wants to destroy them, those who would one day lead to our Messiah, King Jesus. But God Almighty, with His divine wisdom, providence, is working out His plans, not allowing anything to thwart His plans, stop His plans. God is effecting His purposes in the lives of His people. I am that I am. Remember from Exodus, He delivered His people out of bondage in Egypt. Now, here, this same I am is going to deliver, and this is 1,000 years later, the people of the time of Esther. The story itself is obvious at this point. The king knows the answer. He was asking a question, but the king knows the answer. He had to have realized it in analyzing the words of Esther. Remember, I stressed how good her speaking, her speech, her wording, it was very skillful, very intelligent, and the king knows, he has to know that she was quoting the edict that had been written by Haman or authorized by Haman, dreamt up by Haman. The king realizes what this is all about. She's risked her life. She's come before the throne to ask a question. She's turned it into a banquet. The first day turns into a second day. This personal banquet, this delay from the first day to the second day. Remember, the king is the one that set up Haman to this position of authority. The king gave Haman a signet ring. That makes him just as much at fault for this edict, this decree, which he's the king. He had to be the one to sign on nonetheless, but he's just as much at fault. And now part of his reaction could be, uh-oh, I made a big mistake. Haman took advantage of me. He's doing something that's going to take my wife, my queen, away from me. In this, you almost feel, reflecting back on David. You remember the story of David and the adultery. And you remember the one, Jonathan, that came and he told David the story about the lamb, about the neighbor, and about the king, the powerful king that took the lamb from the poor neighbor, this only lamb, this pet lamb that this neighbor loved so dearly, and this powerful king took it away, stole it away. You remember at the end of that when Jonathan looks at David and says, "You are the man." Can't you almost feel that here in this banquet, in this time, in this situation? Well, I'm almost done. Let me, a couple more minutes here real quick. Esther chapter 7 verse 6. And Esther said, "The adversary and an enemy is the wicked Haman." Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. A direct translation here of these words would be man, adversary, and enemy, Haman the wicked, this. So she's now using the king's word. Remember, he said this, which in English, what does that mean? But she's using those words. She's getting herself and the king on the same page. So the words, what he was stuttering, he was stammering, he couldn't put together a full, complete sentence. Now Esther says, here's your words. This is what you are trying to say. She's being direct. She's being purposeful, pointful. This whole time, she's been extremely skillful in her English, her speaking, her intelligence, her wording, not English, obviously. But interesting here that she leaves off the definite article. Instead of saying the adversary or the enemy, she only says adversary and enemy. This, rather than pointing to him as the man, points to him, his character, his nature, what it is that he's made up of. There is no mistake who she is talking about, who she has in mind. No mistake who her target is. This Haman, this diabolical, scheming Haman. He was the enemy of not just her personally, but all of her people, which meant the enemy of the king and the kingdom also. Okay, the last part of verse 6 is very obvious. Haman was terrified. Yeah, I guarantee he was. He was more afraid at that moment than he'd ever been afraid in his entire life. Okay, so we've gone on a little bit longer than I meant to, but we've made it from chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. We'll pick up there next time. Thank you all so very much for watching and being a part of our Bible study. Let's bow, let's pray as we close. Dear Heavenly Father, we love you, we praise you, we thank you for being there, whether we recognize you or not. We thank you, dear Lord, for your faithfulness, for your love, your grace, your mercy. Dear Lord, I pray that you'd help us to focus on the reality of your existence and your ongoing work that you're doing in us and through us, for us and for all of those around us. Help us, dear Lord, to be bold as we go out into this lost and dying world. Help us to be the light and the salt. Help us, dear Lord, use us for your praise, honor, for your glory. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.